to Unit 4 of Sourcing in Procurement and Supply. The fifth section, Liquidity and Gearing Ratios. In the event of paying your liabilities, it is prudent to assess how quick you can convert your assets to cash easily. In this section, we are going to look at liquidity and gearing ratios to help us make constructive decisions. At the end of this section, we should be able to calculate short-term liquidity ratios like the current and quick ratios, calculate gearing ratios, and calculate interest cover. Remember we said in the last two sections that liquidity is when the organization is able to convert its assets into cash in order to meet its short-term obligations, its debt, as and when they arise, or as and when the debts are due. The short-term liquidity is the most fundamentally important set of ratios because they measure the ability of a company to remain in business. Two main ratios relate to the short-term liquidity, measuring the relationship between the organization's liquid assets and its current liabilities. If an organization is not able to meet its short-term liabilities, its short-term debt, the organization most likely is on its way to go bankrupt, on its way going bankrupt. So in order to ensure stability in the buying organization's dealings, they need to assess the supplier's ability to meet its short-term obligations, ability of the suppliers to pay their short-term loans. And we have a set of liquidity ratios to determine that. Two main ratios relate to short-term liquidity, measuring the relationship between the organization's liquid assets and its current liabilities. So these two main ratios are the current ratio and the quick ratio. The current ratio is also known as the working capital ratio. The quick ratio is also called the asset test ratio. The formula for the current ratio or the working capital ratio is simply current assets over your current liabilities. Current assets over your current liabilities to get your current ratios or your working capital ratio. The second ratio is the quick ratio or the asset test ratio. The formula for this is your current assets minus stock all over current liabilities. Your current assets minus stock all over current liabilities. So in your model, you see current stock minus stock. It's a mistake. It's supposed to be current assets minus stock all over your current liabilities. We also have our gearing ratios. That is the funding by shareholders against funding by debt. Gearing is relevant to the long-term liquidity and stability of an organization. It refers to the proportion of a business' long-term funding that is represented by debt or loans as opposed to shareholder capital and reserves. A business is said to be highly geared if a high proportion of its funding comes from long-term debt. So we have high gearing and low gearing. High gearing is when a high proportion of your fund is from debt, long-term debt, and low gearing is when a high proportion of your funding is from your shareholders or your investors. A simple gearing ratio can be expressed as your fixed return capital over ordinary share capital and reserves times 100, or simply put, your debt over your equity. You divide your debt by your equity to get your gearing ratio. The formula is the fixed return capital or your long-term loans. It's not fixed return capital times long-term loans. It's your fixed return capital or long-term loans all over ordinary share capital and reserves times 100. Interest cover refers to how many times an organization can pay its interest expenses from its earning. Interest on loans, also known as the debentures, must be paid whether or not the company makes a profit. The interest cover ratio emphasizes the cover or security of the interest by relating profits before interest and tax, which is also known as the operating profit, like we said earlier, to interest paid. So that is the formula for interest cover, the profit before interest and tax over interest paid. And the profit before interest and tax is the same as our operating profit. So either profit before interest and tax over interest paid or operating profit over interest paid. You do this to get your interest cover. In other words, it indicates the extent to which profits are sufficient to meet interest payments. A high interest cover ratio means that profits are more than sufficient to cover the interest that must be paid. A low interest cover ratio is a danger signal, as this suggests that the company is only just able to meet its interest payments. So this means after calculating our interest cover, the higher the interest cover, the better. By way of summary, we have thoroughly explained liquidity and gearing ratios. We looked at how to calculate short-term liquidity and gearing ratios. We also looked at the concept of interest cover. It is important we understand the implications of the numbers derived from these calculations for decision-making purposes. We are not just calculating these ratios. We should know their implication, what each figure means. What does it mean when our gearing is high? What does it mean if our gearing is low? What does it mean if our interest cover is high? And what does it mean if it's low? We should be able to understand these figures, interpret them efficiently in order to make sourcing decisions. Thank you.